Under the wide Carolina moon, the night breathes slow. The cypress trees bend like ghosts, whispering secrets to the wind, and in the hollow heart of the swamp, a faint, rhythmic pulse breaks the stillness, the ring of iron against iron. Each strike echoes like a heartbeat, steady, defiant. Jonah stands before the forge, his body slick with sweat though the night is cool. The orange glow paints his face in firelight, revealing a man both weary and unyielding. Sparks burst and fade around him like dying stars. He works with purpose, every hammer fall deliberate, every breath measured. To others he is just a blacksmith, shaping tools for his master's fields. But beneath the mask of obedience, his work carries something sacred. The hiss of quenching metal hides prayers. The glow of iron holds defiance. The world around him sleeps, but Jonah's forge does not. For when the living are silent, rebellion breathes through flame. And somewhere beyond the trees, the river listens. From the shadows of the field road, another pair of eyes gleams. The overseer, pale, lean, always watching. He chews tobacco slowly, the bitterness pooling on his tongue as his gaze locks on Jonah's flickering forge. What is the man forging at this hour? Tools or treachery? The overseer can't hear words, but he senses meaning in the rhythm. Too steady, too sure. Too proud for a slave. His boots sink into the damp earth as he takes one step closer, unseen behind the moss-draped oak. The smell of smoke drifts toward him, thick with iron and sweat. He grips the handle of his whip, its leather whispering like a serpent. Jonah does not look up, yet his hammer slows, the rhythm falters for a heartbeat. He knows he is being watched, but to stop now would be to surrender. So he raises the hammer again, not with fear, but with fury disguised as duty, and lets the spark fly higher, daring the dark to knot ice. The overseer lingers a moment longer, then fades into the night, but suspicion, once lit, burns like coal. By dawn, whispers ripple through the quarters. They speak of the blacksmith who works when others dream, who feeds the night with sparks instead of sleep. Some say Jonah is forging chains so light they can vanish in the sun. Others swear he shapes keys that fit locks not yet made. The elders hush the talk, warning that loose tongues draw lashes, but the young ones listen with fire in their eyes. In the fields, the hammer's echo becomes a rhythm hummed beneath breath, a song of iron and will, and when the overseer passes, they bow their heads, but their hearts lift to the forge. They call Jonah's fire the midnight heart, for it beats not for the master's wealth, but for something far older, a freedom that waits beneath ash and ember. As the sun rises over the swamp, the forge grows cold. Jonah stands at its mouth, watching the smoke curl into the sky like a prayer. He wipes his brow and hides the night's work beneath a sheet of burlap. The day will demand silence again, but the sound of iron lingers, echoing through the fields, through the whispers, through the bones of every man and woman who dreams of morning without chains. The boy was born beside the muddy banks of Stono Creek, where the air forever smelled of iron and pine. Long before he became the midnight blacksmith, Jonah was just a barefoot child chasing dragonflies through the reeds. His mother said the world first knew his name when thunder struck the forge and the baby didn't cry. He only listened, wide-eyed, as if the storm had spoken to him alone. His father was a field hand, silent and broad-shouldered, who carried the weariness of generations in his back. When the sun rose, he bent to the rows. When it fell, he sat by the creek and told his son that every man was born with two fides. Res, one that warms and one that burns. You must learn, he said, which one to feed. Those words would live inside Jonah long after the voice was gone. Years passed, and the boy grew into a shadow among the huts. Quiet, watchful, curious about every spark that leapt from the blacksmith's anvil. The old forge master, Elijah, had once been bought from New Orleans, a man with skin dark as cooled iron and hands that could make steel sing. He saw Jonah's gaze one day and nodded for him to step closer. The heat was suffocating. Sweat poured down the boy's face as the old man lifted a glowing bar from the fire. This, Elijah said, is what power sounds like when it's trapped. The metal hissed as it met the hammer, the sound sharp and alive. Under Elijah's guidance, Jonah learned that iron was more than a thing to be beaten. It was a living thing that remembered every strike, every hesitation, every ounce of courage or fear. The lessons were harsh. Burns scarred Jonah's palms, Blisters turned to calluses. The overseers mocked the boy's obsession, saying no slave needed to know the art of the forge. But Elijah ignored them. He whispered secrets in the dark, not just how to shape metal, but how to endure it. Fire don't just make iron stronger, he told Jonah one night, his breath trembling with age. It makes men honest. You hold iron long enough, it tells you who you are. And when the old man's cough worsened, Jonah worked twice as hard, hoping his hammer could keep death waiting. But one dawn, Elijah didn't rise. The forge was cold. Jonah stood before it for hours, until the embers finally sighed their last breath. That evening, Jonah struck the anvil alone for the first time. The sound was wrong, unsteady, but he kept striking until it steadied, until the fire obeyed him. Each blow burned the boy into a man. Each hiss of steel in water whispered his name back to him. Jonah, Jonah, Jonah. Years later, when he looked back on that night, he'd remember something Elijah once said. The fire that teaches you will one day I test you. And as the moonlight touched his scarred hands, he finally understood what that meant. Fire was not just a tool, it was destiny. And from that night on, the forge was no longer just a place of labor. It was an altar, and Jonah its last faithful priest. The dawn crept over the Carolina horizon like a blade drawn slow from its sheath. Inside the forge, Jonah's hammer struck again and again, the rhythm steady, patient, obedient. Or so it seemed. To the white men who came by, he was the perfect craftsman, silent, respectful, his hands quick to serve. He forged horseshoes, wagon parts, and the heavy chains that sealed the slave wagons at night. But to Jonah, each piece carried a ghost, the ghost of a man or woman who'd worn such iron before. The clatter of chain links was a language he'd come to hate. When the overseer inspected his work, Jonah's eyes never rose, yet his thoughts burned hotter than his forge. He learned early that rebellion must hide behind the shape of obedience. So he worked carefully, every strike planned. He polished the shackles until they gleamed like trophies, but inside, near the rivet or the joint, he left a mark no eye could see, a tiny carving in the metal's belly. At first it was a scratch, later a symbol, a curl of flame, a serpent devouring its tail. To any man who didn't know, it was nothing, but to those who did, it meant hope. Some of the older hands began to whisper that Jonah's chains had souls, that they remembered their maker's hatred and longed to break themselves. Weeks passed and the mark spread, passed from one shackle to another like a secret prayer. The overseers noticed nothing. They only cared that the chains were strong and the quotas met. But one night, under a moon swollen and red, a scream tore through the quarters. A field hand named Moses had vanished. The next morning, his shackles were found snapped apart in the dirt. Not pried, not rusted, but broken clean through the center. The overseer cursed, blaming poor iron, but Jonah knew better. His hands trembled as he lifted the fractured link from the ground. Inside the split, his hidden symbol gleamed faintly, kissed by firelight. The discovery spread through the camp like wind through dry grass. Men and women whispered Jonah's name not in fear, but in reverence. The blacksmith had broken a chain. The story bent itself into myth before the sun even set. Some said he'd whispered words into the metal that made it remember freedom. Others swore the forge itself had turned against the master. Jonah said nothing. He only stared at his hands, the same hands that had built the master's fences and the overseer's gates, now accused by miracle. But that night, when the swamp was still and even the crickets fell silent, Jonah stood before the forge again. The fire glowed low, like a dying heart. He pressed the broken link into the coals, watching it soften and surrender to flame. "You broke yourself," he murmured, his voice thick with awe and fear. "You wanted out." Then he raised his hammer, not to destroy, but to remember. The strike echoed deep through the trees, carried by wind and water, a single note of defiance that would one day become a chorus. And for the first time, Jonah smiled in the firelight, not the smile of a servant, but of a man who had touched something eternal. He didn't yet know it, but the moment that chain gave way, the world began to turn again. Against him. The masters would soon whisper too. Suspicion would crawl from the great house like smoke, and the hammer that shaped freedom would soon shape his downfall. But in that moment, standing barefoot before the glow, Jonah felt only one truth. Iron had listened, and now it had spoken back. The morning sun rose pale and unforgiving, washing the fields in a colorless light. The world looked ordinary, but something in the air had shifted, the way the wind carried sound, the way eyes followed him longer than before. By midday, a rider came thundering down the road from the main house. Dust rose behind him like judgment. When he stopped before the forge, Jonah already knew why he'd come. "Master wants you up at the house," the man said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Bring yourself quick, and clean your hands. He don't want soot on his floor." Jonah wiped his palms on his apron, though the stains of iron never truly left. The road to the house wound through the cane fields, and every step up that path felt heavier than the last. The mansion loomed above the swamp like something carved from pride itself, white columns, wide porches, windows that watched like eyes. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and old money. Mr. Callahan sat at the head of his study table, his cane resting across his knees, eyes sharp as cut glass. He didn't look at Jonah at first. He spoke to the overseer instead. "They say a man broke his chains, snapped them clean. Explain to me how iron from my forge betrays its master." The overseer stammered, sweating under the master's calm. I don't know, sir. Maybe bad steel. Could have been faulty." Mr. Callahan turned at last, his gaze landing on Jonah. "Faulty? Or perhaps sabotaged?" Jonah kept his head bowed, voice low but steady. "Iron does what it's told, sir. Sometimes fire changes it, makes it weak." The master rose, walking slow around him, tapping his cane against the floor with each measured step. "You're a good smith, Jonah, the best I've had, but lately your work carries too much soul. Chains aren't meant to sing, boy, they're meant to hold." Jonah said nothing. He could feel the overseer's smirk behind him, could smell his sweat and hate. "Tell me," Callahan said softly, almost kindly, "do you believe a slave can forge freedom?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jonah's heart pounded, but his voice, when it came, was quiet. "I forge what you ask me to, sir. Nothing more." A pause, then a slow, deliberate nod. "Good answer." But when Jonah turned to leave, the master's voice stopped him. "Your daughter, what's her name?" "Ruth. Pretty child. I'd hate to see her go without a father's wages." The words hit harder than any whip. Jonah bowed deeper, murmured a, "Yes, sir," and walked out before the tremor in his hands betrayed him. That night, as the rain began to fall, the overseer dragged a man from the quarters, one of Jonah's friends, accused of helping Moses escape. The others watched in silence as the whip cracked again and again, until the man no longer moved. Jonah stood in the shadows near the forge, every strike echoing through his skull like his own hammer. He could have spoken, could have confessed, but his voice felt trapped behind his teeth. The price of survival was silence, and it tasted like blood. When the punishment was done, the overseer left the body in the mud as a warning. Jonah approached slowly, kneeling beside what was left of the man's face. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and whispered, "I'm sorry." The rain washed the blood into the dirt, but the guilt would not fade. He returned to the forge and lit the fire once more. The hammer felt heavier than ever. Each strike against the anvil was a heartbeat he didn't deserve. And as the storm howled outside, Jonah worked until his arms ached, shaping nothing but grief. By dawn, he had made something new, not a tool, not a chain, but a piece of iron so sharp and beautiful it reflected the fire like a mirror. He didn't know why he'd made it, or what he'd do with it. He only knew one thing: the price of silence was now paid in steel. The river lay hidden beneath a shroud of mist, its slow current whispering secrets no man dared speak aloud. It was here, where the soil turned black and the cypress roots reached like fingers from the earth, that Jonah built his second forge, one the masters would never know existed. He'd carried the tools himself, one by one, through the swamp under moonlight, his footsteps silent and careful. The air was thick with mosquitoes and the smell of wet decay, but Jonah breathed it like freedom. Here, no overseer's eyes could find him. Here, the hammer could strike honest. He worked with a different fire now. Not the kind that served the master's wealth, but the kind that birthed something forbidden. The iron he smuggled came from scraps, broken hinges, rusted blades, the remains of chains that once bound men he loved. He melted them down and reforged them beneath the whispering pines. Every strike felt like a prayer, every spark like a soul set loose. He told himself it was only metal, but deep down, he knew he was shaping destiny. Sometimes, others came, quietly, faces Jonah trusted, a boy named Samuel, whose back still bore the fresh lines of a lash, an older woman, Ruth's caretaker, who brought word from the quarters. They'd stand near the forge, speaking in murmurs over the hiss of molten steel. "You gonna make something for us?" Samuel asked one night, his voice trembling between hope and fear. Jonah didn't answer at first. He stared into the fire, where the orange glow danced like judgment. "Not yet," he said finally. "But soon. What he forged wasn't weapons. Not yet. He made nails, hinges, pieces that could be hidden, traded, used to build what they called the way north. A door that would open when the time was right. Beneath the rhythmic pounding of iron, the river carried their whispers away, scattering them like ashes downstream. By day, Jonah returned to the plantation's forge, the obedient worker once more. But at night, his secret fire burned brighter, the smoke mingling with the mist. He hid the finished work beneath loose earth near the water's edge, chains melted and reforged into symbols of defiance. Sometimes he'd hold one of the cooled pieces in his hand, feeling its weight, its warmth fading slowly. It reminded him of something Elijah once said, "Iron remembers the hand that shapes it." One night, as he quenched a bar of steel in the river, the hiss was louder than usual, a violent, living sound. The water glowed faintly for a moment, then went still. Jonah watched his reflection ripple and vanish. "You saw it," he whispered to the river. "You saw what I made." That same week, rumors began to crawl through the quarters like smoke. Someone had seen men in the swamp, their faces hidden, their voices low. Someone else said Jonah had melted chains into blades. Each version twisted the truth a little more, but in every telling, the blacksmith's fire grew brighter, his legend stronger. One evening, Ruth found her father sitting by the forge, staring at a half-finished link of iron. "Papa," she asked softly, "why you always work when it's dark?" He smiled faintly, though the light in his eyes was tired. "Because the dark listens, child, and the day don't." She nodded, not understanding, but the words would stay with her. By the end of that summer, the swamp forge had birthed its final creation, a chain made of broken shackles, each link reshaped by Jonah's hand. When it was done, he carried it to the river, knelt, and buried it beneath the mud. The current lapped at his wrists, cool and patient. As he rose, he looked toward the horizon where the plantation lights flickered faintly through the trees. "Someday," he murmured, "these waters will wash them clean." The river said nothing, only sighed as if it understood. And when Jonah walked back through the cypress grove, the sound of his hammer echoed once more, but softer this time, not as defiance, not as duty, but as a promise. The rains came early that autumn, soaking the red clay roads and turning the fields into rivers of mud. The overseer's whip grew quieter as the weather worsened, but the silence that followed was not peace, it was suspicion. The air felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Even the hounds seemed uneasy, howling at the nights as if they sensed the forge's hidden glow beyond the tree line. Jonah worked slower in those weeks. He still swung the hammer by midnight, but now he kept one ear tuned to the world beyond the walls. Every crack of thunder, every branch breaking in the wind, might have been a boot on the path. The overseer had grown restless since word of movements spread along the river, slaves missing, horses gone, smoke seen where there should be none. At the main forge, Jonah kept his head bowed. His hands worked steady, obedient, but the overseer's eyes were on him more than ever. That man, Calder, had a way of smiling without warmth. His teeth gleamed pale beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze always too steady, too sure. "You work late, Blacksmith," Calder said one morning, running a gloved hand along a row of sharpened hoes Jonah had finished. "Seems you got a fondness for the dark." Jonah wiped his brow. "The iron don't sleep, sir." Calder laughed softly, a sound that didn't belong to laughter. "No, but I reckon some men forget who Hey, work for in the dark." That night, Jonah didn't go to the swamp. The rain came down too hard and the path had flooded waist-high. He stayed in the quarters instead, listening to the wind push through the cracks in the walls. Ruth lay beside him, asleep, her small hands clutching the corner of his shirt. In the dim candlelight, Jonah's mind went to the forge hidden among the cypress, the tools, the melted chain, the half-forged hinges waiting for his hand. He wondered if the river was keeping his secret, or if it had already betrayed him to the storm. By the next morning, Calder's men were in the fields, searching. They said they'd found footprints where no one should have been, men's boots, not bare feet. Jonah's stomach twisted when he heard it. He went about his work as always, but his heart beat faster with every swing of the hammer. At noon, a group of white men rode up from the road, their horses slick with rain, their coats glistening. They spoke with Calder at the barn, too quiet to hear. Ruth's caretaker, old Mabel, whispered to Jonah as she passed the well. "They askin' about you, child. Said they found iron what wasn't plantation made." Jonah kept his head low. "You tell 'em nothing, Mabel." "I won't," she said. "But you best bury whatever truth you got left." That evening, before the sun could die, Jonah slipped away toward the swamp. He carried nothing but a small satchel. Inside it, the papers Ruth's mother had kept hidden, and a single iron key he had made months ago. It wasn't a key for any door. It was a symbol, one he'd meant to give Ruth when she grew old enough to understand. When he reached the forge, the place felt wrong. The coals were cold, the air smelled of wet ash. He crouched and touched the ground. The mud bore fresh tracks. Boots. His breath caught. He turned toward the river, ready to run. But a voice came from the shadows. "Didn't I tell you the darta? Don't sleep." Calder stepped forward, a pistol drawn, the rain dripping from his hat brim. "You've been a busy man, Jonah." Jonah said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the buried chain, hidden somewhere beneath the swamp's black water. Calder tilted his head. "You think I don't know what you been making? Think I don't know what all them whispers mean? You and your kind, you want a war." Jonah's hand twitched near the forge table. There was a hammer lying there, heavy and slick with rain. "I just make iron," Jonah said quietly. Calder smiled, stepping closer. "Then make me believe it." The night swallowed the sound that followed. Thunder or gunfire, no one could tell. But by dawn, smoke rose faintly from the swamp, and the rain had washed away every footprint. Ruth would wake to an empty bed, her father's shirt folded neatly beside the hearth. The only thing left of him was the smell of smoke and a single small key lying in the ashes. And far off, beneath the cypress roots, the chain of freedom, Jonah's final work, slept beneath the river, waiting for the hands that would one day lift it again. The plantation woke to whispers. They said the blacksmith was gone. Some claimed he'd run north. Others swore he'd been taken, drowned in the swamp where no one would find him. The overseer offered no word, only stood at dawn by the edge of the marsh, staring into the fog as if expecting Jonah to rise from it, hammer in hand. Days passed. The forge went cold. The fields grew quiet, as though the land itself had drawn a long breath and refused to let it go. Yet the air was not still. Something moved beneath the silence. In the quarters, Ruth asked where her father had gone. Mabel told her he was on the wind now, shaping thunder the way he used to shape iron. Ruth didn't understand, but each night, when the wind rattled the shutters, she swore she could hear the echo of metal striking stone, soft, distant, steady. One night, a group of riders came from Charleston, men in uniforms, speaking in low tones to Calder. They brought news. A riot upriver, a warehouse burned, slaves vanished. They spoke of weapons forged in secret, chains broken clean. Calder's face turned hard as iron. "That blacksmith," he said under his breath. "He started this fire." The men rode out again before sunrise, and though their boots left deep prints in the mud, the next day the tracks were gone, washed away by rain, as if the land refused to remember them. But others remembered. By the week's end, strange things began to happen. A padlock on the tool shed split open without key or crowbar. The main gate's hinge cracked straight through the metal, though no hammer had struck it. And one morning, the overseer's own shack door hung loose. The latch bent. The lock melted at the seam. He called it sabotage, said someone was testing him, mocking him, but the slaves whispered otherwise. Jonah's hammer still swingin', they said. Ain't no ghost, just justice. At the edge of the swamp, where the cypress leaned over the black water, a shimmer of light sometimes flickered, faint, rhythmic, like fire on wet steel. Those who saw it didn't speak of it aloud. They only crossed themselves and worked harder the next day, heads bowed, eyes to the ground. But Ruth saw it one night. She woke before dawn and crept past the sleeping quarters, following the sound. Slow, hollow strikes in the distance. The swamp was thick with fog, but the rhythm was clear, the same her father once made when shaping iron. She stepped onto the soft earth near the old path. The air smelled of ash and river moss. And there, just beyond the reeds, she saw it, a glow beneath the water, orange and pulsing like a heartbeat. Her breath caught. She knelt, touching the mud. It was warm. "Papa," she whispered. A faint hiss answered, steam rising where the glow met the rain. Then the sound stopped. The light faded. The swamp went still. Behind her, Mabel's voice came soft through the mist. "Child, you let the dead rest. His work's already done." Ruth turned, tears glinting in her eyes. "But he ain't gone." Mabel nodded slowly. "No, not gone. Just waiting." That night, Ruth hid the small iron key beneath her pillow. She didn't know what door it opened, but she felt its weight, its warmth, like it still carried her father's heartbeat. By morning, the overseer ordered the swamp burned, saying it bred snakes and ghosts alike. Men poured oil through the brush, set fire to the roots. Flames rose high, red and angry, swallowing the cypress shadows. But when the smoke cleared, the old forge still stood, untouched, blackened but whole. And those who listened closely swore they could still hear the faint ring of metal in the distance, steady as before. The blacksmith's song. The sound of rebellion beneath the ash. The rhythm of freedom waiting to be struck again. The fire had died, but the smoke lingered, curling low across the plantation like a restless spirit. Ash clung to the air, to the leaves, to the skin of every living thing. The swamp was gone now, burned to the bone. Yet in the stillness that followed, no one spoke Jonah's name aloud. Calder called it cleansing. He said the land needed purging, that fire drove out evil and order would return. But deep inside, he feared what the flames hadn't touched. He had seen it with his own eyes, the forge still standing, charred but unbroken, its anvil cool and waiting. It made him feel watched by something old, something that refused to die. The slaves moved through their days with hollow eyes. Their hands worked the cotton, but their minds were elsewhere, caught between fear and a rising hope they dared not name. They whispered only at Niggs, their voices thin as smoke. "He's still there. The hammer don't rest." One evening, as twilight bled into the fields, Ruth found something in the ashes near the old path, a piece of iron, smooth and curved like a crescent moon. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the soot. It was part of a broken chain, reforged once more. The metal was warm. She hid it beneath her dress and returned to the quarters. That night, while the others slept, she took it out and set it beside the small key she'd kept since her father vanished. 2 pieces of him, silent and heavy. She held them close, feeling the pulse of something greater than grief. A calling. Elsewhere, the overseer's temper grew. He rode through the fields at dawn, snapping his whip over empty air just to remind the workers of who still ruled. But his voice was thinner now, his shadow smaller. Even the horses sensed the shift. They shied at the edge of the swamp, refusing to step near the burned earth. By the 3rd week, the plantation's luck began to turn sour. Tools broke for no reason. Chains rusted overnight. The new blacksmith, a man brought from another estate, quit after 2 days, saying the forge was cursed by a man who ain't done yet. Calder ordered the forge torn down, piece by piece. The men obeyed, but when their hammers struck the anvil, the sound rang wrong, too sharp, too alive. One man dropped his tool and ran. Another fainted dead away. Calder cursed them all and struck the anvil himself. The sound that followed silenced everything. Birds, wind, even breath. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, rolling across the fields like distant thunder. The men stared as the metal began to glow faintly beneath his hand. Calder stumbled back, eyes wide, muttering, "It ain't natural." That night, the anvil cracked clean in two. Ruth heard the sound from the quarters and knew. She rose, went to the window, and saw lightning spider through the sky above the swamp's edge. It wasn't stormlight. It was something else. A pulse, slow and deliberate, like the echo of a hammer. She whispered a prayer she'd never been taught, one made of memory and fire. "Keep his hand steady, Lord. Keep his fire burning." In her dreams that night, Ruth saw her father standing in the mist, his arms bare, his face calm. He lifted the hammer once more, but this time, when it struck, the sound didn't come from the forge, it came from the earth itself. The next morning, Calder was found sitting in the ruins of the forge, staring at the broken anvil. His hair had gone white overnight. When the preacher came to ask what happened, Calder only said one thing, over and over. He struck it again. At midnight, he struck it again. And far beyond the plantation, in the distant towns of Carolina, rumors began to rise, of tools that broke their chains clean, of black men vanishing in the night, of hammers ringing deep in the swamps where no man lived. The blacksmith's legend had become more than memory. It had become a movement, one forged in secret, tempered by fire, and struck in rhythm with freedom's heart. Rain returned to South Carolina that autumn, slow, heavy, endless. It fell for 7 days straight, turning the fields to rivers and the roads to veins of red mud. The sky hung low, bruised and swollen, as though the heavens themselves carried grief too great to hold. But beneath that sorrow, something else was stirring. The overseer's men whispered that the rain was Jonah's doing. His forge quenched at last, his hammer echoing through the storm. Calder scoffed at the talk, but even he flinched when the lightning struck close, splitting a tree not 10 feet from the old smithy's ruins. In the quarters, the slaves spoke in low voices by candlelight. They said the rain was cleansing the land, loosening the soil where chains lay buried. Ruth listened from her cot, clutching the iron key against her chest. The fire in her father's old forge might have gone dark, but she could still feel its warmth in her bones. One night, unable to sleep, she slipped out into the rain. The fields shimmered silver under the lightning's brief glare. She moved barefoot through the mud until she reached the edge of the swamp, or what remained of it. The cypress trees were nothing but blackened spires now, but the ground beneath them still steamed faintly, as if something alive pulsed below. She knelt and placed her palm against the wet earth. It was warm. "Papa," she whispered, voice trembling, "if you can hear me, tell me what to do." The answer came not in words, but in rhythm. The rain itself began to fall harder, beating the mud in a strange, deliberate cadence. It wasn't random. It was the same pattern Jonah used to make when shaping metal. 3 strikes, pause, then 1. Ruth's breath caught. She whispered it back, tapping her fingers to the beat. "I hear you," she said softly. "I hear you." The next morning she told Mabel what she'd felt. The old woman looked at her with weary eyes. "Child, some fires don't die when they should. Maybe he's still calling. Maybe he's waiting for you to listen." By the week's end, Ruth began gathering scraps of iron, nails, hinges, broken links from discarded chains. She worked in secret, just as her father once had. The same place, the same rhythm. Each night, the sparks rose from the wet earth, faint but determined. Word spread quickly. Men and women from nearby plantations began to come after dark, moving silent as ghosts through the rain. They brought pieces too, tools, locks, bits of rail. Together, they melted them down in a pit fire, forming not weapons, but symbols. Small iron circles, smooth and heavy, the mark of Jonah's forge. Each one bore a single notch, the sign of freedom yet to come. When Calder discovered one of the circles buried near the barn, he ordered the quarters searched. But no one spoke, and no one broke. He found nothing but rain and silence. Still he felt watched. The walls of his house groaned at night. The roof dripped even when the sky was clear. Once, in the middle of prayer, he swore he heard the faint ring of a hammer beneath the floorboards. He told himself it was imagination, but fear gnawed at him. He began carrying his pistol even to bed. Ruth, meanwhile, kept forging. Each circle she made she gave away quietly, slipped into a hand, left by a doorstep, buried beneath a tree. They called them rings of the Anvil, a promise that no chain was unbreakable. One night, as the rain eased, Ruth looked into the fire and saw her reflection beside another. A man's face, calm and glowing faintly in the smoke. "Papa," she whispered. The figure didn't speak, only raised the hammer once more, striking the air. The sound echoed, deep and distant, like thunder beneath the ground. Then he was gone. The rain stopped the next day. The clouds parted. And for the first time since the burning, sunlight touched the forge again, glinting off the circles of iron Ruth had shaped. Each one shimmered like a promise fulfilled. Each one carried the rhythm of her father's hand. And in that rhythm, South Carolina began to stir, quietly, powerfully, like metal remembering its fire. The morning broke in a haze of gold and smoke, the kind of southern dawn that felt heavy with memory. The fields glistened under the dew, and for the first time in months, the air carried a strange peace, fragile, almost fearful of being shattered. Yet beneath that quiet hum, something restless moved through the land. It began with the sound, faint at first, then stronger, a metallic pulse echoing from deep within the woods. 3 strikes. Pause. 1. The rhythm that had once belonged to Jonah now rippled through the countryside like a heartbeat reborn. Calder woke in a sweat, the echo still ringing in his ears. He thought it was a dream until he heard it again, far away, but steady. He threw open his shutters and looked toward the swamp. The morning mist hung thick, but he swore he saw flashes of orange light within it. "No," he whispered to himself, "no more ghosts." But the hammer didn't stop. Across the neighboring plantations, men began to vanish, not in panic but with purpose. They slipped away after dark, following the rhythm through the trees. By dawn, only their footprints remained, washed away by river mist. And in their places, the masters found symbols, small iron rings, pressed into the soil, gleaming in the morning light. Ruth knew what it meant. Each ring was a call, a gathering. The forge was no longer just hers. It belonged to every soul that had ever felt the sting of a lash, every heart that had burned for something greater. That night, she led them. Dozens of men and women, their faces hidden beneath hoods and cloth, gathered around the glowing pit. The rain had cleansed the land, but the earth still remembered the fire. The air shimmered with heat, and the hammer's rhythm returned, struck now by many hands, not one. Ruth stood before them, holding her father's old tongs, blackened by time. "He built this with his own hands," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just the fire, but the hope. And now it's ours to keep." A murmur rose among the crowd, soft at first, then growing, a chorus of prayers and defiance woven together. They began to forge again, melting scraps of iron, shaping them into tools, blades, and chains no longer meant to bind. Every strike sent sparks leaping into the dark, lighting faces streaked with sweat and tears. In the distance, the overseer's riders came, their lanterns flickering through the trees, but by the time they reached the clearing, the forge was gone. Doused, covered, vanished as if swallowed by the earth itself. Only the faint ring of metal lingered in the air. Calder rode through the woods until dawn, his horse panting, his hands shaking. He found the riverbank where the first forge once stood, and there in the mud lay a single piece of metal, an unfinished link shaped halfway between chain and circle. He picked it up, feeling the warmth still pulsing through it, and dropped it as though it burned. "Curse you, Jonah," he hissed. "You'll not haunt me forever." But when he turned to leave, he heard the sound again, not from behind him, but beneath him. A deep, steady pounding, like the heart of the earth itself striking in time. He froze, every muscle locking tight. The horse reared and bolted, leaving him alone in the fog. Back in the quarters, Ruth sat by the dying embers of the fire. The others slept, their work hidden, their dreams heavy with what was to come. She opened her palm and looked at the two relics she still kept, the key and the small crescent of iron. "Your chains ain't gone," she whispered, "but they changin'." Outside, thunder rolled low across the horizon, but it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of hammers, many hammers, striking in rhythm far away, in places where freedom had begun to stir. And as Ruth closed her eyes, she imagined her father standing again by the anvil, smiling through the smoke. His fire hadn't died in the swamp. It had spread. It lived now in every spark, every blow, every breath of those who dared to shape their own fate. The sound grew louder. The anvil's song was rising again, the rhythm of rebellion forged in silence, the fire that no storm could drown, the heartbeat of a man who struck the anvil at midnight and taught a people how to make thunder. The winter came sudden that year, a hard, brittle cold that cracked the river's skin and silenced the frogs along the marsh. The air turned thin and sharp, and every sound carried farther, clearer, even the hammer, especially the hammer. By now, the overseers no longer rode alone. Patrols swept the woods in pairs, guns ready, their dogs sniffing the dark like they smelled rebellion itself. They searched for Ruth, for the vanished workers, for the blacksmith's fire that would not die. But all they found were ashes, old footprints, and the whispering of trees. At Bellefontaine Plantation, fear had settled like frost. Calder's hands shook as he drank his morning coffee, eyes darting to the forge that no longer stood. His hair had gone silver, his voice hoarse from shouting. The fields still produced, but something in the air was wrong. The rhythm of the place had changed. The slaves no longer sang the old work songs. Their silence was heavier than prayer. At night, Ruth and the others moved through that silence, guided by the old rhythm. 3 strikes, pause, 1. They followed the sound across the backwoods, through abandoned mills and hollowed barns, until they reached an old foundry by the river. Its roof sagged, its walls split by vines, but inside stood an anvil, rusted and waiting. Ruth touched it gently, brushing away the dust. The metal was cold, lifeless. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Wake up." The others lit the fire, feeding it with driftwood and pine resin until the forge came alive again. Its glow turned their faces gold, their breath thick with hope. And when the first hammer fell, the sound rolled through the night like thunder over frozen fields. They worked for hours, shaping tools, mending links, building symbols, a ring for every soul that refused to bow. Their hands bled, their clothes smoked, but no one stopped. When exhaustion came, Ruth remembered her father's words. "Iron don't care who shapes it. It just remembers the fire." The next morning, those who'd fled carried the forged rings north. They hid them in pockets, in the lining of coats, in the soles of shoes, each one a token, a promise, a map. In the cities, people whispered of them. Freedom's mark, they called it, a symbol of the anvil that rang at midnight. But freedom has a price, and the South always came collecting. By February, soldiers arrived at Bellefontaine, claiming authority from Charleston. They questioned everyone, searching for signs of rebellion. Calder welcomed them eagerly, thinking salvation had come. But when they asked about the missing slaves, about the secret forge, his answers faltered. He said the man responsible was long dead. The captain only stared. Then why do we still hear his hammer? That night, as the soldiers slept in the big house, the hammer rang again, loud, defiant, near enough to rattle the windows. The dogs howled. Men ran outside with rifles, firing blindly into the trees. But the sound didn't stop. Ruth, hidden in the woods, watched the chaos unfold. She held her breath, feeling the rhythm in her chest. For every shot they fired, the hammer answered. It wasn't fear she felt now. It was strength. The next morning, the soldiers found the anvil gone from the ruins. No footprints led away, no cart tracks, nothing. Just a single iron circle left in the mud, glinting in the pale winter sun. Calder stared at it for a long time. "He's still out there," he whispered, "still shaping." And in the distance, faint but clear, came the low ring of steel striking steel, echoing across the frozen fields, carried by the wind. Ruth smiled through her tears. She knew then what her father had meant all along. The forge was never a place, it was a promise, a rhythm that passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, until no man could silence it. That night, when the others asked if they should stop, she shook her head. "No," she said softly, feeding another log to the fire. "The anvil don't rest, not while there's still chains to melt." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but beneath it, faint and steady, the hammer struck again, the same rhythm as always, the sound of faith turned into fire, the song of a people remembering how to rise. The rain had not stopped since dawn, turning the red clay roads into rivers of mud that swallowed footprints whole. In the fields, the overseers shouted for the harvest to continue, their voices drowned in the storm. But Jonah was not in the fields anymore. He stood beneath the ancient oak by the river's bend, where the earth had begun to give way. The night before, he'd dreamed of fire consuming the mansion, and when he woke, he could still smell the smoke. The storm's roar muffled his every movement. He could feel it, the weight of what he'd done and what had yet to come. The anvil in his forge had grown cold, its echo replaced by the pounding of his own heart. There was no going back now. From the shadows, Ruth approached, her shawl soaked and clinging to her shoulders. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, a small hammer, one of Jonah's first creations, now dulled by years of use. "They're saying the overseer's gone," she whispered, eyes wide with both hope and terror. "Vanished in the storm. No one's seen him since last night." Jonah's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The truth was heavier than any iron he had ever lifted. The overseer hadn't vanished. He'd fallen, his body dragged by the current that night when the river swallowed the edge of the road. Jonah had tried to save him, but the man's rage and panic had turned the rescue into a struggle. One slip, one cry, and then silence. Ruth saw the truth in his eyes. "Jonah," she breathed, "what did you do?" "I did what needed doing," he said quietly. "Ain't no freedom forged without the sound of breaking chains." The wind tore through the trees as lightning forked across the sky. Ruth's hand trembled as she held the hammer out to him. "Then you'll need this again. They'll come for you, Jonah. Maybe not tonight, but soon." Jonah took the hammer, feeling its weight, the symbol of everything he'd built and destroyed. "They already here," he murmured, looking toward the horizon. Through the curtain of rain, lanterns flickered near the road, dozens of them swaying like ghosts. The riders had come. He turned to Ruth. "Go. Take the children north by the old river path. Follow it till you find the cypress crossing. Tell Caleb I sent you." Her voice cracked. "And you?" "I stay." The words were final. There was no trembling in them, no fear. Jonah turned toward the forge, its roof half collapsed from the storm. He stepped inside, the smell of soot and rain mingling like a sermon. He placed the hammer on the anvil, where sparks still glowed faintly beneath the ashes. Outside, hooves thundered closer. The riders were shouting now, their torches painting streaks of orange through the rain. Jonah closed his eyes and began to strike the anvil, once, twice, again and again. The sound echoed across the plantation like a heartbeat, like a signal. The enslaved who heard it in the distance knew what it meant. It was not the call of labor. It was the call of uprising. Ruth's silhouette disappeared into the trees, clutching the children close. The storm roared, the fire hissed, and Jonah raised the hammer high one last time. When the riders burst through the forge doors, all they saw was light, a blinding burst of flame and steel. The forge exploded into the night, showering the swamp with sparks that looked like stars breaking free. And in that moment, amid the chaos and thunder, Jonah, H of South Carolina, became a name the wind would carry long after the fire was gone. The winter came sudden that year, a hard, brittle cold that cracked the river's skin and silenced the frogs along the marsh. The air turned thin and sharp, and every sound carried farther, clearer, even the hammer, especially the hammer. By now, the overseers no longer rode alone. Patrols swept the woods in pairs, guns ready, their dogs sniffing the dark like they smelled rebellion itself. They searched for Ruth, for the vanished workers, for the blacksmith's fire that would not die. But all they found were ashes, old footprints, and the whispering of trees. At Bellefontaine Plantation, fear had settled like frost. Calder's hands shook as he drank his morning coffee, eyes darting to the forge that no longer stood. His hair had gone silver, his voice hoarse from shouting. The fields still produced, but something in the air was wrong. The rhythm of the place had changed. The slaves no longer sang the old work songs. Their silence was heavier than prayer. At night, Ruth and the others moved through that silence, guided by the old rhythm. 3 strikes, pause, 1. They followed the sound across the backwoods, through abandoned mills and hollowed barns, until they reached an old foundry by the river. Its roof sagged, its walls split by vines, but inside stood an anvil, rusted and waiting. Ruth touched it gently, brushing away the dust. The metal was cold, lifeless. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Wake up." The others lit the fire, feeding it with driftwood and pine resin until the forge came alive again. Its glow turned their faces gold, their breath thick with hope. And when the first hammer fell, the sound rolled through the night like thunder over frozen fields. They worked for hours, shaping tools, mending links, building symbols. A ring for every soul that refused to bow. Their hands bled, their clothes smoked, but no one stopped. When exhaustion came, Ruth remembered her father's words. "Iron don't care who shapes it, it just remembers the fire." The next morning, those who'd fled carried the forged rings north. They hid them in pockets, in the lining of coats, in the soles of shoes, each one a token, a promise, a map. In the cities, people whispered of them. Freedom's mark, they called it, a symbol of the anvil that rang at midnight. But freedom has a price, and the South always came collecting. By February, soldiers arrived at Bellefontaine, claiming authority from Charleston. They questioned everyone, searching for signs of rebellion. Calder welcomed them eagerly, thinking salvation had come. But when they asked about the missing slaves, about the secret forge, his answers faltered. He said the man responsible was long dead. The captain only stared. Then why do we still hear his hammer? That night, as the soldiers slept in the big house, the hammer rang again. Loud, defiant, near enough to rattle the windows. The dogs howled. Men ran outside with rifles, firing blindly into the trees. But the sound didn't stop. Ruth, hidden in the woods, watched the chaos unfold. She held her breath, feeling the rhythm in her chest. For every shot they fired, the hammer answered. It wasn't fear she felt now. It was strength. The next morning, the soldiers found the anvil gone from the ruins. No footprints led away, no cart tracks, nothing. Just a single iron circle left in the mud, glinting in the pale winter sun. Calder stared at it for a long time. "He's still out there," he whispered, "still shaping." And in the distance, faint but clear, came the low ring of steel striking steel, echoing across the frozen fields, carried by the wind. Ruth smiled through her tears. She knew then what her father had meant all along. The forge was never a place. It was a promise, a rhythm that passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, until no man could silence it. The years rolled on like the slow river through the swamp, steady, unrelenting, carrying away the memories of those who once toiled beneath its shadow. The old Belle Grove plantation was gone now, its fields reclaimed by wild reeds and cypress roots. Only the chimneys still stood, skeletal and defiant against the Carolina sky. But whispers still lingered. They called it Jonah's ground. Some feared it. Others came seeking something sacred in the ashes. On a humid summer morning, a traveler arrived from Charleston. His name was Reverend Solomon Price, a preacher with skin like dark oak and eyes that carried storms. He had come not to condemn, but to remember. He walked barefoot through the overgrown path, past the rusted gates that once chained men to labor. His every step stirred the ghosts of the past. When he reached the ruins of the forge, he set down his Bible and began to speak, not to the living, but to the dead. "They said he struck the anvil at midnight," Solomon murmured, voice trembling like a hymn. "They said his hammer spoke in tongues louder than any sermon. I've come to hear it, Lord. I've come to hear the sound again." The air thickened. Cicadas fell silent. In the heavy stillness, the preacher lifted a piece of broken iron from the dirt. It was cold, though the sun burned high. The shape of the metal was strange, curved and unfinished, as if Jonah's last work had been left waiting for completion. Solomon held it close, and for a moment he could swear he heard something, a heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic pulse of iron and memory. That night, he gathered the descendants of the enslaved who still lived nearby. They lit torches and circled the forge's remains. The preacher raised the piece of iron high and said, "This is not a curse, it's a calling. What he began, we must finish." The people nodded, silent tears tracing their faces. Old Ruth's granddaughter stepped forward, clutching a rusted hammer passed down through generations. She placed it beside the preacher's feet. "He made this," she whispered. "My granny said it was his last." Solomon picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than any tool should be. But when he struck it once against the iron plate buried beneath the earth, the sound rippled through the swamp, deep, resonant, alive. Birds took flight. Frogs fell quiet. The echo rolled through the trees like a spirit set free. In that moment, every listener felt it. Jonah was still here. His fire hadn't died. It had only changed hands. The preacher smiled through his tears. "He forged more than metal," he said softly. "He forged a covenant." That night, they built a small fire on the ruins of the forge, and one by one, each person laid a piece of iron in the flames, a nail, a chain link, a plow blade, symbols of both bondage and survival. The fire glowed red, then white, and as the smoke rose into the black sky, it carried the scent of iron and hope. From that night onward, every year, the people of the Low Country gathered at Jonah's ground. They didn't call it worship, they called it remembrance. And when the fire was lit, someone always struck the anvil 3 times, just as Jonah had, a rhythm older than chains, a song stronger than fear. And though no one ever saw him again, some swore that in the shimmer of heat above the fire, a man's silhouette could be seen, broad-shouldered, hammer raised, his face lost in the glow of his eternal forge. The wind swept low across the marshlands, stirring the reeds like whispers from another age. The ruins of Bell Grove were long gone now, swallowed by time, reclaimed by moss and mud. But the story had not vanished. It lived on in the hearts of those who still listened for the sound of the hammer. The story of Jonah, the blacksmith who struck freedom from iron and fire, had become more than a tale. It had become a truth buried deep in Carolina soil. 100 years later, the land had changed. Roads now cut through the fields where cotton once grew. Wooden shacks had turned to brick homes, and the voices that once cried beneath the overseer's lash now sang in churches under open skies. Yet the swamp still held its secrets. A young boy named Elijah, barely 13, walked along the overgrown path that led to the old forge site. He had heard the stories all his life, how his ancestor forged chains that were meant to bind, only to break them in spirit. His grandmother used to say, "That hammer still beats, child. You just got to listen right." Elijah reached the clearing as the sun began to fall. The ground was uneven, the air thick with the scent of rain. He crouched beside a stone half buried in mud. It was blackened, scarred, once part of the forge's foundation. He brushed away the dirt and found something carved into it. 3 faint marks side by side, not letters but strikes, hammer strikes. A breeze stirred the cypress trees. The boy froze. Somewhere, far away, a metallic sound rang through the air, soft, distant, deliberate. It came once, then twice, then a third time. Elijah's heart raced. "Grandma," he whispered, though she was long gone. "You hear that?" He stood, listening. The swamp seemed to breathe around him. The metallic sound faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of his own heartbeat. Then, as the first drops of rain fell, he saw it, a faint glow in the tree. Ease ahead, warm, flickering light, as if a fire had been kindled where no fire should be. Drawn by something he couldn't name, Elijah stepped forward. The glow grew brighter. It wasn't flame, it was reflection. A slab of old iron, half buried, shining wet under the rain. When he reached down to touch it, the metal was warm. In that instant, a sound filled his ears, not with noise, but with memory. He heard men singing low songs in the fields, the ring of the hammer, the cries of freedom carried on the wind. He saw a figure, tall, powerful, outlined in firelight, striking again and again, sparks dancing like stars. Then it was gone. The rain poured harder, dousing the faint light. Elijah stood in silence, trembling, soaked to the bone, but smiling. He whispered into the wind, "I heard it." The next morning, he returned home and told his mother what he had seen. She didn't laugh. She only nodded and said, "Then you know, child, some fires don't die. They wait." That year, Elijah began learning to work metal from an old smith in Charleston. He said he wanted to build things that lasted, gates, tools, iron signs for the townsfolk. But late at night, when no one was around, he would strike the anvil 3 times, slow and steady. The sound rolled through the workshop, through the streets, through the still Carolina air, echoing like a ghost, or maybe a promise. Generations later, in the very heart of South Carolina, a memorial stands, a black anvil set upon a stone pedestal, no name carved upon it, only 3 small marks chiseled into the base. Visitors who come to read the plaque sometimes claim they feel warmth radiating from the iron, even in the coldest months. And if they linger past dusk, when the cicadas fade and the fog rolls in, some swear they hear it, the sound of hammer on steel, ringing faint but clear, somewhere deep in the swamp. The sound of Jonah's anvil. The sound of freedom being forged again and again beneath the eternal southern night. The night had fallen quiet over the Carolina marshes, the kind of stillness that feels sacred, where even the frogs hold their breath. Decades had passed since Elijah's time, and yet the land still seemed to hum with the memory of what once was. Now it was 1963. The world had changed again. The streets of the South echoed with marches, chants, and the thunder of footsteps demanding what should have always been given: equality, dignity, freedom without chains. Yet beneath the roar of history, there was another rhythm, older, steadier, the faint, forgotten echo of the hammer. Amara Williams stood before the rusted gate of the Bell Grove site, now overgrown with vines and wild jasmine. She was a teacher from Columbia, come searching for her family's roots. Her grandfather had spoken of Jonah, the midnight blacksmith, as though he were more myth than man, but Amara was not looking for stories. She was looking for truth. She carried a small lantern, its light swaying over the tangled brush. Her shoes sank into the mud as she pushed through the tall reeds, guided only by instinct and a tattered map drawn in her grandfather's hand. He had marked an X where the forge once stood. When she finally reached the clearing, the world seemed to hold its breath. The ground was uneven, littered with fragments of scorched brick and shards of old iron. She knelt, brushing away moss from a large flat stone. And there it was, the 3 hammer marks, weathered but unmistakable. Amara's throat tightened. "You were real," she whispered. "You weren't just a story." The wind rose, rustling the trees as if in answer. She could almost feel it, the energy, the memory, the ghost of a forge long gone, but never truly silent. She took a small notebook from her satchel and began to write, sketching the stone, tracing the marks with her pencil. Her words flowed like prayer. Here, und, the moon. A man made history from heat and defiance. Then faintly, she heard it. The sound of metal striking metal, just once. Then again, 3 times, slow, deliberate, eternal. Amara froze. Her lantern flickered, the flame dancing like it recognized the rhythm. She turned toward the sound, but there was nothing. Only the swamp, breathing softly in the dark. Her heart pounded. She set the lantern down and whispered into the emptiness, "If you're still here, I'll tell them. I'll tell them what you did." The 3rd strike came again, clearer this time, like an answer. When Amara returned to Columbia, she began her research in earnest. She found records buried deep in county archives, an inventory from 1838 listing one blacksmith of uncommon skill, another from 1841 describing a nighttime disturbance near the forge. She pieced together names, places, fragments of truth. Months later, she published an article titled "The Blacksmith Who Forged the Dawn." It spread quietly at first. Among historians, among black churches, among those who knew that freedom's story wasn't written only in speeches or marches, but in sweat and fire and courage. Soon, the name Jonah began to reappear. In classrooms, in sermons, in songs sung beneath church rafters. A story resurrected not by power or politics, but by a woman who refused to let the anvil fall silent. On the anniversary of her article, Amara returned to Belle Grove. She brought her students with her, children who had never known chains but lived in the shadow of their echo. They lit candles, placed them in a circle around the stone, and stood in silence. Then, from the edge of the swamp came 3 faint clangs, metal on metal, ringing through the night. The children looked up in awe, but Amara only smiled. "Listen," she said softly. "That's him. That's Jonah." And as the sound faded into the dark, "Setaz," he whispered a promise carried on the Carolina wind. "Your hammer never stopped. We're still striking." That night, under a crescent moon, the swamp glowed faintly red, as if somewhere deep beneath the earth, the forge had found its fire once more. The century turned again. The swamp had changed, but not its soul. Where the forge once stood, a paved road now curved through pine and marshland, leading to a quiet memorial garden. There, on a raised stone, stood Jonah's anvil, dark, weathered, eternal. Every year, on the anniversary of the rebellion that birthed his legend, people gathered beneath the cypress trees to remember. It was the year 2025, and the crowd was larger than ever. Students, historians, blacksmiths, descendants, all drawn by a story that had refused to die. The sky hung low and gray, the air humming with that strange southern electricity that always seemed to awaken ghosts. At the front of the crowd stood Marcus Williams, a blacksmith himself, the great-great-grandson of Amara. He'd grown up hearing about Jonah as others might hear bedtime stories or parables. But for Marcus, it wasn't just history. It was inheritance. He stepped forward to the anvil, his dark hands roughened by the same work that once defined Jonah's life. The air grew still as he lifted a small iron hammer, forged in his own shop, but cast in the same mold that had been passed down through his family for nearly 2 centuries. Its handle was scarred with initials, JWW. Marcus looked out over the crowd. "They tried to bury his name," he said, voice low, resonant, but the sound he made was too loud for silence. A murmur rippled through the audience. The moment felt timeless, as if the swamp, the forge, the man, and his story were all breathing through him now. He placed the hammer on the anvil. The sound echoed sharp and metallic, cutting through the humid air. Once, twice, 3 times, the same rhythm, the same heartbeat. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, bending the trees and stirring the lanterns. The cicadas went quiet. For a long, still moment, it seemed the world listened. Then the sky broke. Rain fell heavy and sudden, washing over the memorial, soaking through the soil that had once been scorched by rebellion. People didn't run. They stood in it, faces lifted, letting the water mix with tears. Marcus looked down. The hammer was glowing faintly, heat shimmering from its head, though no fire touched it. He blinked, unsure if it was real or if his eyes were deceived by the stormlight. But then he heard it, deep, resonant, unmistakable. The ring of the forge. From somewhere deep below, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, came the sound of hammer on metal. The same 3 strikes Jonah had once made under the moonlight. The crowd fell silent. Some gasped. Others closed their eyes, whispering prayers or names long forgotten. Marcus raised his voice through the downpour. "He's still here," he said, "still working." In that moment, the anvil seemed to hum. The chain-shaped memorial glowed, faint and pulsing like molten steel. The people stood transfixed, soaked, silent, alive. And just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The rain slowed. The swamp exhaled. Marcus placed the hammer back upon the anvil and whispered, "Rest easy, old man. We'll keep striking." The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving candles flickering in puddles, their reflections dancing across the black metal monument. As night fell, thunder rolled once more across the horizon, not in anger, but in rhythm. 3 steady beats, like the echo of an ancient oath. Somewhere, miles away, an old blacksmith's shop in Charleston trembled. its tools rattling softly against the wall as if answering the call. And for those who truly listened, the message was clear. Jonah's fire had never died. It had only changed hands, again. The hammer, the forge, the song of resistance. They belonged now to every soul who refused to bow, and under the weight of the southern rain, the anvil of Jonah shone like it had been freshly forged, a mirror of the human spirit, burning quietly against the dark. The dawn after the storm came soft and silver, spreading a pale light across the Carolina marshes. Mist clung low over the cypress roots, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and iron. The Bell Grove site stood silent once again. But something had changed. The anvil, slick with rainwater, glimmered faintly in the first light, as though the fire from the night before had never truly gone out. It had been 2 centuries since Jonah struck the anvil at midnight, but his rhythm still lived, in whispers, in bloodlines, in the pulse of a people who refused to forget. A young girl named Nia Williams, Marcus's daughter, stood barefoot near the monument that morning. She had snuck out before sunrise, drawn by something she couldn't name. Her father was still asleep back in Charleston, unaware that the echo of his own words, "We'll keep striking," had stirred something deeper in her than he knew. The air felt alive. Every sound, the croak of frogs, the sigh of the wind, seemed to carry a rhythm. She approached the anvil, tracing her fingers over the initials JW etched into its base. Her small reflection rippled in the water pooled upon its surface. "I heard you," she whispered. "Last night, I heard you." A soft wind brushed her face, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Not fire, but memory. She looked toward the trees, where the mist parted just enough to reveal the faintest shimmer of heat, like sunlight bending through glass. Within it, for an instant, she thought she saw a man's silhouette. Tall, strong, hammer in hand, his form glowing with the light of the forge. She blinked, and it was gone. But the air remained charged, almost humming. Nia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of metal her father had given her, a scrap from his workshop, shaped like a chain link. "He said this was yours," she said softly, placing it on the anvil. "He said you broke it once. Maybe it's time to finish it." She raised a stick and tapped it 3 times against the metal. The sound rang out, bright, clear, alive. Somewhere deep in the swamp, an unseen echo answered. Nia smiled. "I knew it," she whispered. When she returned home, her father was waiting. His expression was stern at first, then softened when he saw the light in her eyes. "You went to the site, didn't you?" he asked. She nodded. "I think he talked to me." Marcus exhaled slowly. "He talks to all of us, in his own way." That evening, father and daughter went into the workshop together. Marcus lit the forge, its fire blooming gold against the dusk. Nia stood beside him, eyes wide as the heat breathed life into cold metal. "This," Marcus said, handing her a small hammer, "is how you listen." She struck once. The metal sang. Again, it glowed. A third time, and the flame danced higher. Her heart pounded. For a moment, she swore she heard another hammer join hers, distant but in perfect rhythm. Marcus smiled faintly. "You hear him too, don't you?" Nia nodded. "He's helping." As night fell over Charleston, the two worked side by side, father and daughter, carrying forward a fire 2 centuries old. Outside, rain began again, soft and steady, tapping against the roof like the beat of a distant drum. In the final hours before midnight, when the forge glowed brightest, Marcus lifted his eyes to the window and whispered, "You can rest now, Jonah. We'll carry the sound." And from deep within the flame, a single spark burst forth, brighter than all the rest. It floated upward, then vanished into the night. Far out across the Carolina swamp, a faint metallic echo rolled through the mist, to demtere, slow, solemn strikes that faded into eternity. The song of the anvil, the heartbeat of the free, the end of chains, and the beginning of legacy.